Okay, so this lecture is going to be about the U.S. response to World War II, and when we eventually got involved, how the war affected the home front. So we're going to start off with as war broke out in Asia and Europe, we tried to remain neutral, and Congress had passed the neutrality laws in the 1930s. These laws were intended to avoid the mistakes that led us into World War II. So the laws included things like the U.S. could not sell weapons to countries at war. The U.S. could not lend money to countries at war. And if Americans traveled on ships of countries at war, it was at their own risk. So again, trying to prevent what had dragged the U.S. into World War I, we're trying to prevent that again for World War II. And if you remember, the Lusitania sinking in 1915 angered a lot of Americans because it was a British ship that was sunk, but there were many Americans who died on that ship. However, once war really broke out in Asia and Europe, our attitudes changed a little bit. Most Americans still wanted to stay out of it, but we started to realize that our neutrality laws actually helped the aggressors because the aggressors had the weapons they needed while their victims they're not. And just a reminder, the aggressors are Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the victims would be Britain, France, and China. And we realized that if Germany and Japan were not stopped, we would be next, and President Roosevelt really believed this. So he was trying to figure out how to help the victims of the aggressors so that they could fight back against the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, and to kind of prevent the spread of Germany and Japan. So Roosevelt came very close to breaking or violating the neutrality laws, but he kind of looked for loopholes. He looked for ways that the U.S. could help the victims and stop the aggressors without actually violating the neutrality laws. All of this happened before Pearl Harbor, and we're going to take several actions that are going to make Japan think we aren't neutral. So the first action is we sent angry notes to the aggressors. So the neutrality laws didn't say anything about expressing an opinion. So the U.S. sent letters to the enemy, or sent letters to Japan and Germany telling them that the U.S. thought what they were doing was bad. Obviously, and there's going to be no impact on Hitler. If anything, it just annoyed him. The impact on Japan is a little bit bigger. Japan was dependent on this, and they were all about pride, and they didn't want to admit that they were wrong. But the angry letters aren't going to stop them. Our second action that we take is moving the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. So our Navy would be closer to Japan. Japan saw this as a threat, which it was. Our Navy thought it was a bad idea and a trap because it'd be easy for ships to get stuck in the harbor if a ship went down, which thankfully did not happen when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Our third action is we set up our first ever peacetime draft in 1940. It's the first time a draft was put into action during a time of peace. The peacetime draft law was passed in the United States, and it lasted until the Vietnam War. Having a draft law would require everyone to register to let the government know how many people would be able to be in the military, as well as who they were. And people were starting to be called into the military to start training while we were still at peace. And kind of along the same lines, we realized that we didn't have enough supplies, like weapons and ammo, for the Army. Our fourth action is we traded some extra destroyers to Britain in return for some bases in British colonies in the Americas in 1940. To this day, we still have a base in Canada from this exchange. But again, we're giving extra destroyers, so extra ships to Britain in return for some bases in the British colonies. And we did this because we wanted to make sure Germany couldn't take over colonies near the U.S. So we were on those bases so we could defend ourselves. Our fifth action is we stopped selling scrap metal to Japan in 1940. We were their main supplier. They needed that metal to make ships and planes and other things, so that's going to hurt them. Our sixth action is we started the Lend-Lease program, and we loaned war materials to Britain from 1941. Later, we loaned materials to Russia as well. So we would loan these war supplies to Britain, China, and anyone that was fighting Germany and Japan for nothing. And at the end of the war, they would give us back what they had left. The law said we couldn't give them weapons or money or loan them weapons or money. The law said we couldn't give them weapons or money. It never said we couldn't lend them weapons. And this ended up being one of the most powerful things we did in World War II because we supplied our allies with weapons throughout the whole war. We keep lending them weapons even when we started to get involved in the war, and it wasn't illegal to sell, but the allies couldn't afford them. We allowed another action is we allowed Britain to train their pilots and repair ships in the U.S. so they could train efficiently and effectively because they wouldn't be interrupted by bombings or being killed while they were in the United States. And ships in Britain were targeted by Germany, so they were able to fix them in the U.S. And then our final action that we took that sort of pushed everything over the edge is we stopped selling aviation fuel to Japan, and we froze their bank accounts in the U.S. so they could not buy anything in the U.S. That's 1941. Obviously, these actions kind of show that we have clear favorites during the war, which makes us not really neutral. We did things that convinced Japan and Germany that we were their enemy. And 4 days after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the U.S. So we got forced into the war because Japan attacked and Germany went to war with us.